the peaceful town shrouded in hidden secrets. Nestled in a quiet corner of the Midwest, the town of Evergreen Pines seemed to be the very definition of a picturesque small-town America. Rolling hills with endless cornfields stretched out as far as the eye could see, dotted with barns painted in fading reds and whites. The downtown area, if one could even call it that, consisted of a handful of family-run businesses, a diner with a faded neon sign, a hardware store that hadn't updated its inventory since the late 70s, and the old movie theater that still charged only $5 a ticket. Every Saturday you could find half the townsfolk gathered around the little green park, sipping lemonade during the farmer's market. On Sundays the church bells would ring, calling everyone to service, the sound echoing through the quiet streets like a comforting hymn. It was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to go wrong. Children rode their bikes unsupervised, weaving through the narrow streets as older residents nodded at them from porch swings. Neighbors knew one another by name, and front doors often remained unlocked. Evergreen Pines was more than a town. It was a community where everyone considered each other a friend. Gossip here wasn't malicious, it was often lighthearted, the kind of whispered exchanges you'd overhear in the church pews or while standing in line at Marge's diner. "Did you hear about Ruth's new pie recipe?" Or, "Poor Ted, his tractor broke again. Let's get a group together to help him out." Yet, for all its lovely imperfections, Evergreen Pines had its shadows, veiled beneath its warm surface, buried beneath decades of smiles and handshakes. Maybe it was the simplicity of the town that left too much room for secrets to grow, the kind of secrets no one dared to confront, where silence became safety, and looking the other way was just easier. "I've always loved this town," Mrs. Callahan, an elderly widow, would often say to newcomers over at the post office. She'd adjust her thick-rimmed glasses and give them a big grin. "We look out for one another. We're like family here." And that was the image Evergreen Pines was proud to maintain. But as anyone who's lived in a small town long enough would tell you, there's a fine line between familiarity and surveillance. Everyone knows everyone, their business, their habits, their weaknesses. Sometimes that closeness could feel suffocating, even dangerous. The town's history wasn't without blemish, of course. Old-timers recalled peculiar incidents like folks vanishing from their homes in the middle of the night back in the 60s, or unexplained fires that ravaged a couple of barns. But these stories were never spoken of in detail, always brushed aside as if clinging to the notion of simplicity and innocence was more essential than uncovering the truth. New residents would quickly learn that questions about these events were met with furrowed brows and abrupt changes of subject. Someone once joked that Evergreen Pines should add, "Don't ask, don't tell," to its welcome sign. That one didn't go over well. Amongst the photo-perfect homes with their neatly trimmed hedges, small cracks began to show. Hidden feuds between neighbors, whispered affairs, and the gnawing rivalry between the Carter and Henderson families that had persisted for generations, though no one exactly remembered why. Small grievances festered into lifelong grudges, but in public, everyone pretended to get along. It was simply easier that way. A woman named Ellen Carter once confided in her best friend during a quiet coffee date at the diner. "Do you ever feel like this place watches you, like no matter where you go, someone's always keeping an eye?" Her friend Patty merely chuckled, brushing it off as Ellen's nerves. "It's just small-town charm, Ellen. People care, maybe a little too much." But Ellen wasn't mistaken. Behind the charm, Evergreen Pines was a bubbling cauldron of jealousy, longing, and ambition too quiet to expose itself openly. The grocery clerk who smiled warmly at you at checkout? He'd been nursing a decades-old vendetta after losing his high school sweetheart to the guy who ran the gas station. That sweet lady who baked pies for every charity event? Her pristine reputation hid years of cutting accusations against her own family. Even the pastor, with his kind eyes and gentle sermons, had a look about him that sometimes suggested he knew far too much, maybe more than he was willing to share. And then, there was Daniel Carter, the town's golden boy, everyone's favorite neighbor. The man whose steady hands built half the town's porch swings. He was the glue that seemed to hold Evergreen Pines together, always lending a hand, always smiling. No one could have guessed that his seemingly perfect life, his loving wife, his wide circle of friends was about to unravel, and with it, the carefully curated peace of the town itself. Because in towns like Evergreen Pines, the deeper you dig, the darker the secrets you'll find. And when someone as trustworthy as Daniel could vanish overnight, it sent shockwaves through the delicate facade of this seemingly perfect community. The very serenity that drew people to Evergreen Pines, its quiet, its closeness, proved in chilling moments to be its most perilous attribute. After all, what safer place to conceal your darkest secrets than in a town where no one wanted to look too closely? The strange disappearance. It was a crisp autumn evening in Evergreen Pines, the kind where the air smells faintly of burnt leaves, and the distant sound of crickets creates a soothing symphony. Daniel Carter, a man who was as predictable as the ticking of a well-wound clock, hadn't returned home. The golden hues of the sunset faded into gray as his wife Mary paced back and forth in their modest kitchen. Dinner sat untouched on the table, the roast chicken slowly growing cold under the dim light of a hanging lamp. Mary was a practical woman, not given to flights of imagination, but tonight, something felt off. Daniel never stayed out late, not without calling first. He'd been working at the hardware store all day, sorting through dusty shelves and fixing the old register that everyone in town swore would give up the ghost sooner rather than later. He was supposed to come home by 6 in time to sneak in a quick chapter of his latest novel before dinner, something by Steinbeck he never got enough of. By 7:30 Mary had picked up the phone and called the hardware store, though she already knew it would go straight to voicemail. She tried his cell too, but it rang unanswered. A pit started to form in her stomach, and like a bad habit, her mind worked its way toward the worst. For better judgment or not, she dismissed it. People don't just vanish in Evergreen Pines, she told herself, not in a town where everyone knows who you are and where you're supposed to be. By 8, Mary was pacing on the porch, biting her thumbnail, a nervous tic she thought she'd left in high school. Streetlights flickered on, casting their orangish glow onto the empty front yard and the narrow street beyond. Occasionally a car rolled by, one or two neighbors waved, but no one stopped. He's probably just helping someone, she muttered under her breath. Knowing Daniel, he was fixing someone's roof or lending a hand with that damn tractor of Ted's again. The thought comforted her for a moment, but the knot of unease in her chest refused to loosen. Concern growing, Mary decided to call their neighbors. First, Sarah from across the road. "Hey, Mary," Sarah answered, her voice warm and familiar. "What's up? Have you seen Daniel tonight?" Mary asked, trying to sound casual but failing. "No, can't say I have. Everything all right?" Sarah asked, the concern creeping into her tone. "Yeah," Mary lied. "I think so. He's probably just running late." But after hanging up there was no denying it, this wasn't like him. Something wasn't right. By 9, Mary called her brother-in-law, Tom Carter, who lived on the other side of town. "Tom, it's Mary. Have you heard from Daniel?" she asked, the tremor in her voice betraying her growing worry. "Not since this morning," Tom replied. She could almost hear him sitting up straighter on the other end, tension lacing his words. "Why? What's going on? Isn't he home?" "No," Mary admitted. "And, I don't know, Tom, it's late. He didn't call and, I don't know, the truck's gone, but I just keep thinking he's in some trouble." She swallowed hard, fighting the lump rising in her throat. Tom, dependable as ever, didn't waste time. "I'm coming over, don't worry Mary, we'll find him." By 10, half the Carters and a handful of close friends had gathered on Mary's porch. Flashlights in hand, their faces illuminated by an eerie mix of porch light and moonlight. Mary couldn't stop wringing her hands, hating how fragile she felt in front of everyone. "It's not like him," she kept saying over and over, as if repeating it would somehow turn it into proof. Tom tried to comfort her. "He's fine, Mary. Men like Daniel, they don't just disappear. He's probably down at the lake or, heck, maybe his truck ran out of gas somewhere. Let's not panic yet." But panic was starting to bloom in all of them, whether they admitted it or not. The lake. Without realizing, everyone's gaze turned toward the dark silhouette of the woods at the edge of town. It loomed threateningly in the distance, the kind of place that seemed perfectly innocent during daylight but took on an entirely different character at night. By 11, the town sheriff, Walt Henderson, had been called. He was an old family friend, practically an uncle to Daniel since childhood. Mary felt simultaneously relieved and uneasy at his arrival. If Walt was involved, this was no longer just a case of a late husband stuck with a flat tire. Walt tugged at his belt as he walked up the porch, his wide-brimmed sheriff hat tipped low over his tired eyes. "All right, Mary," he started, his voice steady, calm, the way only an experienced officer can sound. "Where was Danny supposed to be last?" Mary hated how cold it sounded, how procedural it all suddenly felt, but she told him. She recounted how Daniel had left for work that morning, the details of his usual schedule, how he was supposed to come home, how he always did. "And he didn't mention going anywhere after work?" Walt asked. "No," Mary whispered, "nothing." By midnight, a search party of locals had formed under Walt's direction. They divided into groups, flashlights cutting through the black velvet of the countryside. It was still too early to call in actual reinforcements, Walt explained. It might embarrass Mary and Daniel if it turned out he was just minding his own business somewhere. Mary reluctantly agreed, but she hated the way Walt's voice faltered, as if he wasn't so sure this would end with a sheepish Daniel apologizing for the trouble. The town's men spread out in concentric circles. They headed toward the outskirts, the woods, the lake. As Walt went to join his group, he paused and placed a hand on Mary's shoulder. "We'll find him. We always do." But Mary could see that look in his eyes, the one that told her he'd seen too much in his years. By 1 in the morning, the search turned up nothing but crickets and cool autumn air. Mary stood on the porch, her arms folded tight against her chest, watching flashlights bob like fireflies in the distance. "Where are you, Danny?" she whispered to the dark. By sunrise, all the hope and denial that had kept her moving turned to a cold dread. Something was horribly wrong. When Tom returned looking somber and Walt avoided meeting her gaze, the knot in her stomach turned to stone. And when the call came at noon the next day, that someone had found Daniel's truck parked in the woods, driver's seat empty, keys still in the ignition, it wasn't relief she felt. It was fear, raw and unrelenting. Daniel Carter, the man everyone knew, the man who always kept his routines, had vanished without a trace. And in Evergreen Pines, a place where stability was cherished above all else, the cracks in its tranquil facade began to show. The search in vain. The morning after Daniel's disappearance was cold and somber, the kind of gray sky that seemed to press down on Evergreen Pines like a weight. By the time the clock struck 7, the news had spread. Daniel Carter was officially missing. It's not like someone could go unnoticed long in Evergreen Pines. Coffee-colored trucks idled outside picket-fenced driveways while neighbors exchanged worried glances and murmured to one another on their porches. "Not Danny," an elderly Mr. Jenkins muttered to himself as he adjusted his suspenders. "He's the rock. The guy who'd give you the shirt off his back. He wouldn't just vanish." Tom Carter, Daniel's brother, had mobilized a group of men from the fire department and a few hunting buddies to widen the night's search. "We'll start at the woods," Tom instructed, his voice steady though his tired eyes betrayed his worry. "Then circle out toward the lake. If there's anything that looks out of place, you stop and call." The men nodded grimly, gripping their flashlights and thermoses of coffee, their breath hanging in the chilly morning air. Despite their usual camaraderie, there was an uncomfortable silence among the group. The question they weren't asking out loud was, what would they find, and would they be prepared to see it? By 9 a.m., the search expanded to include much of the town. Teenagers and stay-at-home parents joined the effort, forming smaller clusters, armed with maps scribbled on napkins, flashlights, and crudely made sticks for prodding the underbrush. Children, who normally played carefree along the sidewalks, were kept inside under strict orders from their parents, a rare sight in a town like Evergreen Pines. "I can't just sit here," Mary said as she stuffed wool gloves onto her trembling hands. "I have to go out there. I can't stay in this house another minute." Sheriff Walt stopped her at the door with a firm but gentle hand. "Mary, I understand," he said softly, his weathered face kind but assertive. "But you're not helping anyone if you exhaust yourself. Stay by the phone, we'll call the moment." He hesitated, swallowing his own doubt. "The moment we find something." She wanted to argue, wanted to push past him and head straight for the woods, but Mary nodded and sank into the porch swing. She barely recognized her own reflection in the living room window, her lips pale, her eyes sunken. Out in the woods, the search parties were struggling. The sprawling forest bordering Evergreen Pines was a mix of old gnarled oaks and dense pine groves that seemed to stretch endlessly. Sunlight barely pierced through the canopy, leaving shadowy pockets where anything or anyone could be hidden. A distant group of men called out Daniel's name in unison, their voices echoing through the barren branches. But their calls were met only with the sound of rustling leaves and the occasional interruption of a startled bird taking flight. "You think there's even a chance he's out here?" asked Joe Harper, a longtime friend of Daniel's who now held a flashlight in one hand and a two-way radio in the other. Joe had the look of an old farmer who'd seen more than his share of bad seasons. His grizzled beard and heavy boots looked right at home in the wild. Tom hesitated, scanning the woods in front of him. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice tight. "But if we don't keep looking," he trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. By midday, the search had turned up nothing. A few cigarette butts here, a couple of discarded soda cans there, typical remnants of teenagers sneaking off to hang out in the woods, but no sign of Daniel. No footprints, no torn fabric, no truck keys or signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if the earth had swallowed him whole. When the word spread that the lake would be searched next, a quiet uneasiness settled over the townspeople. Evergreen Lake wasn't large or particularly deep, but it had always carried an air of mystery. Kids would swap stories about a shadowy figure who lived in the water, ready to drag careless swimmers under. Adults dismissed it as child's play, but on nights when the moon was low and fog rolled off the surface, even the bravest locals avoided it. Walt stood at the edge of the lake that afternoon, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, muddy shore. He directed a nearby team of volunteers to wade through the shallows, the water freezing cold as it soaked through their pants and boots. Others were stationed with makeshift tools, long poles, fishing nets, even rope, to scour the edges of the lake. Mary had been reluctant to stay at home, but Walt thought that she didn't need to see this, just in case. "I don't like it," one of the younger volunteers muttered as he squatted by the shore, his hands trembling as he examined some algae-covered branches. "You think anyone does?" replied Mike Henderson, Walt's nephew and one of the deputy cops. His flashlight glanced over the rippling water, searching for something, anything, that shouldn't be there. "But if Daniel's out here, we need to bring him home, one way or another." And then someone shouted. A younger man near the far side of the lake, almost hidden by the cattails, raised his arm and yelled, "Hey, over here!" Within seconds, a throng of people rushed toward him, splashing through the shallows and trampling over the muddy grass. Walt arrived first, his steely presence commanding everyone to step back. "What did you find?" he asked sharply, his heart pounding. The volunteer shook his head, holding up what looked like a torn piece of plaid fabric. Walt exhaled sharply, immediately recognizing it as the same color and pattern as Daniel's favorite flannel jacket. Nearby, someone cursed under their breath. Walt ordered his team to widen the search grid around the area. The optimism sparked by the small discovery quickly dissolved into frustration when hours passed without any further sign of Daniel. The torn fabric could have come from anywhere, they told themselves, unwilling to let their hope wither completely. As night fell again, the searchers reluctantly trudged back to their homes, their flashlights fading into the darkness one by one. Mary stayed up all night, her phone clutched in one hand, while her other hand absent-mindedly traced the embroidery on the couch pillow beside her. She refused to sleep, refused to give in to the quiet whispers of fear clawing at the edges of her mind. By now, the town felt different. The camaraderie that once defined Evergreen Pines was turning into something darker, paranoia. Neighbors began to eye each other differently, combing through their memories for signs they might have missed. No one wanted to say it out loud, but the thought lingered in everyone's mind. What if someone they knew had a hand in Daniel's disappearance? The shocking discovery. By the time the morning sun broke through the tree line, casting long golden rays across Evergreen Pines, the search party had grown quieter, more deliberate. The hopeful conversations and half-hearted jokes that had floated through the air the night before were now replaced by a somber determination. The town's residents, many of whom had joined the search just to feel useful, began stepping back. Something in the air had shifted, an unspoken dread that maybe this wasn't going to end with Daniel Carter walking back into town, rubbing the back of his neck and sheepishly explaining some silly misunderstanding. That hope was shattered by noon. The call came through from one of the outer search groups, a group of young men who'd ventured deeper into the woods near Evergreen Lake, past where the muddy hiking trails dissolved into untamed terrain. It was Tom Carter's voice on the walkie-talkie, crackling and rushed. "Walt! Sheriff, you better get down here, there's something by the clearing, looks like Daniel's truck, and..." His voice faltered. "Something else." Sheriff Walt Henderson gripped the walkie tightly, his brow furrowing as he signaled to the group nearest him. "All right," he said, his voice calm yet heavy. "Show me where." Walt and a handful of volunteers trudged through the dense woods, their boots squelching in the damp soil as they followed Tom's earlier directions. As they approached, the smell hit them first, not putrid decay but the sterile chemical scent of motor oil mixed with wet rust. In the distance, the gleam of Daniel's truck reflected off the dappled sunlight. "God help us," a man behind Walt whispered. The truck was parked in a crooked angle, half hidden by the shrubs where it had been abandoned. The driver's side door was closed, as was the passenger side, but the keys dangled from the ignition. It looked untouched, almost eerily so, no scratches, no broken windows, nothing to suggest anything out of the ordinary, but it was what lay just beyond the truck that froze everyone in their tracks. Tom stood pale-faced among the group, pointing toward the lake's edge, where the marshy ground gave way to cattails swaying in the wind. Walt exhaled, gathering himself, and pushed through the curious onlookers to see for himself. There, in the shallows just beneath the rippling surface, he saw it. A shape. At first glance it could have been a clump of clothing caught on a rock or perhaps some tangled debris washed up from the lake bed, but there was a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that stopped them all cold. Walt tilted his hat back, stepping closer to the water's edge. "Stay back," he barked, raising his hand to keep the others from getting too close. "No one touch anything." One of the men, Joe Harper, waded cautiously into the knee-high water, his boots splashing softly. He bent down, reaching for the fabric's edge with shaking hands. As he pulled, the object shifted, and a collective gasp rippled through the gathered crowd. The face of Daniel Carter emerged, pale and bloated, his once familiar features barely recognizable beneath the still mask of death. His flannel shirt clung to his chest, weighed down by the lake's cold grasp. His eyes, usually so kind and full of life, were wide open, fixed in a glassy, unseeing stare. "Oh God," someone breathed. Another turned and vomited into the bushes. Walt closed his eyes briefly, muttering something under his breath, a prayer perhaps, and motioned for the others to step back. "That's Daniel," he confirmed grimly, though no one had doubted it. Mary didn't collapse when she heard the news. She didn't wail or scream or run through the crowd like some might have expected. Instead, she sat on her porch silent and motionless as the sheriff approached her. "Mary," Walt began softly, removing his hat, his voice thick with an emotion he struggled to contain. "We found him." He didn't need to say more. By the time the forensics team arrived from a neighboring county, the initial shock had turned into a numb acceptance among the gathered townsfolk. But as professionals examined the scene more closely, the situation only grew darker. Daniel's body was pulled from the lake and laid carefully on a tarp. Now, under the unforgiving scrutiny of daylight, the truth emerged. Or at least part of it. Visible under the soaked fabric of his shirt was a dark, circular wound on the back of his skull, crusted and jagged, as if inflicted by a blunt object. And it wasn't just one. A closer look revealed further bruising on his torso and arms, signs of a struggle, or perhaps the aftermath of a calculated attack. The coroner, a stern woman named Dr. Evelyn Page, adjusted her glasses and crouched by the body. "This wasn't an accident," she murmured, almost to herself. Walt leaned in, crossing his arms. "What are you thinking, Evelyn?" he asked, reluctant but needing to hear it. Dr. Page's expression hardened. "The trauma to his head? That's no slip and fall. Someone wanted him dead, and made sure of it." The words hung in the air like an unforgiving echo, each syllable twisting into the hearts of those who'd believed in the safety of their small town. Nearby, someone found a torn piece of fabric snagged on the driver's seatbelt, its edges blood-stained, and its threads frayed as though it had been ripped during a struggle. In the truck bed, a strange object, a woman's black shoe, lay settled in a puddle of collected rainwater, stark and out of place. Speculation ran rampant among the gathered locals, whispered conversations blooming like wildfire. Who could have done this? Someone from town? One of us? It doesn't make sense. Walt straightened, exhaustion settling into his bones as he turned back to the crowd. "All right, folks," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed his own unease. "Go home. I mean it. This scene is closed to the public. We'll get answers, but standing here gawking won't do Daniel any good." One by one the residents trickled away, though their murmurs carried through the woods, casting an invisible net of tension over evergreen pines. Back at the station that evening, Walt pored over the evidence, his fingers drumming against the counter as Dr. Page's words echoed in his mind. This wasn't an accident. No, Walt thought to himself as his jaw tightened. This wasn't an accident at all. This was murder, and whoever did it was still out there. The police get involved. The discovery of Daniel Carter's body jolted Evergreen Pines awake in a way no sunrise or church bell ever could. By dawn the next day, the small, modest police station nestled on Main Street had erupted into a hive of activity. The thud of boots against hardwood floors, the static crackle of radios, and the low murmurs of officers exchanging notes created a buzz that echoed through the otherwise serene town. Sheriff Walt Henderson, who'd always been more accustomed to resolving stolen bikes and parking disputes than investigating murders, now stood at the center of chaos. His office, a small room cluttered with papers, community awards, and a half-empty mug of black coffee, had become the war room. Maps of the woods near the lake lay spread out over the desk, dotted with circled markers where evidence had been flagged. Walt leaned on the edge of the desk, his weathered face creased with exhaustion and something heavier, responsibility. "Let's stick to facts first," he said to his deputies, setting his jaw. His voice, a low rumble, carried the weight of commanding respect. "I don't care about rumors or theories yet, I care about hard evidence." Deputy Mike Henderson, Walt's nephew, flipped open his notebook, where scribbled notes barely kept pace with his thoughts. "We've got the confirmed trauma to the back of Daniel's head," Mike began. "Dr. Page said it's consistent with an object, something heavy, maybe metal or wood." "And the blood on the driver's seatbelt," interjected Officer Jane Harper, an ex-urban cop who moved to Evergreen Pines a decade ago. "It's no accident. Someone tried to drag him out of that truck before—" She paused, the end of the sentence hanging bitterly in the air. Walt nodded grimly and crossed his arms. "Where's that shoe? The black one they found in the truck bed?" Jane stepped forward, holding up a plastic evidence bag. Inside was a woman's black heel, scuffed and wet, the tip lined with thin streaks of mud. In a town like Evergreen Pines, where the townsfolk rarely dressed to impress, it was a strange, out-of-place detail. "Still waiting on prints or fibers from the lab," Jane said, her tone clipped. "Gonna take a few days." "Days," Walt repeated, his voice low but taut. "The way this town's gossip works, we don't have days before this whole thing blows up." He rubbed a hand over his face, the scrape of his stubble audible in the otherwise quiet office. He'd spent decades balancing friendship with law enforcement in Evergreen Pines, and now more than ever, he felt the weight of both. Across town the gossip was already boiling over. At Marge's diner, where coffee mugs clinked loudly and syrup-drenched pancakes left sticky fingerprints on tabletops, the regulars whispered theories over their breakfast. "Did you hear about the shoe?" Betty Jenkins murmured, leaning over her coffee. "They say it ain't even Mary's size," replied Tom Foster, stabbing his fork into a sausage link. "So who's it belong to?" By mid-morning, Walt and his team had amassed enough fragments of evidence to make their first move. He drove his dusty patrol car down quiet Elm Street, his face set in a mask of determination. He knew his actions were being watched. The town may have been large in square miles, but it was small in every other way. Windows shifted open and curtains moved as he passed by. The residents were subtle but curious. His destination, the Carter house. Mary Carter opened the door before Walt could even knock. Her face was pale, puffy from restless nights of tears, and her hands trembled faintly as she gripped the frame of the screen door. "Sheriff," she muttered, her voice thin and cracked, Did you find out who—" She couldn't finish the question. Walt removed his hat and looked at her wearily. "Mary, I need to ask you a few more questions," he said gently, though the tightness in his throat betrayed the hardness of his visit. "For my investigators." She nodded, stepping aside to let him in. The house felt hollow. The weight of Daniel's absence hung heavy in every corner. His coffee mug still sat on the kitchen counter, his boots by the door. A small framed photo of him and Mary on their wedding day sat on the mantel, the glass covered in a thin layer of dust. Walt took a seat at the kitchen table, his presence filling the small space like a tentative storm cloud. Mary sat across from him, her fragile hands clutching a tissue she wasn't using. "Do you know anyone who might have wanted to hurt Daniel?" Walt asked finally. He hated the bluntness of the question, but had learned over the years that leading into such matters seldom made them easier. Mary's face twitched, her eyes darting to the side for a brief moment before snapping back to his. "No," she said too quickly, her voice too thin to convince anyone, even herself. "Everyone loved Daniel. He had no enemies." Walt pressed forward, his voice remaining steady but gaining weight. "Mary, I know this is hard, but secrets have a way of surfacing in investigations like this. If there's anything you know, anything, it's better to tell me now." For a split second something flickered in Mary's expression, fear, perhaps guilt, but it was gone before Walt could grasp it. "I don't know, Sheriff," she whispered hoarsely, her gaze dropping to her lap. "All right," Walt said finally, leaning back. He could tell there was more buried beneath her calm facade, but forcing it wouldn't work. Not yet, at least. By the time Walt left the Carter house, the air outside felt thicker. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with the clean, piney scent of Evergreen Pines, but it didn't clear his head the way it usually did. At the station, the pieces of evidence slowly began to pile up. Witness statements, timelines, physical evidence, all spreading out like puzzle fragments across a cluttered bulletin board. The black shoe, the blood on the seatbelt, the strange positioning of Daniel's truck. They all screamed foul play, but none of it formed a full picture. Jane slammed a folder onto Walt's desk in frustration later that afternoon. "We know it's homicide, Sheriff," she said angrily, "but we've got nothing solid tying this to anyone yet. No prints, no weapon, no direct motive, just whispers and speculation." Walt looked up at her with tired eyes, his hand running absent-mindedly over his unshaven chin. "Then we keep digging," he said. "We go back to that lake, that truck, the entire damn woods if we have to, piece by piece until something breaks." That evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon and cast long shadows over the trees, Walt stood in the parking lot of the station, sipping cold coffee from a styrofoam cup. The town hadn't seen an investigation like this in decades, or ever, and the thought clawed at Walt's mind like a splinter. The killer was still here, hiding, maybe even sitting in his favorite diner booth sipping sweet tea and pretending to grieve like the rest of them. "We'll catch 'em," Jane said from the station doors, breaking his thoughts. Walt nodded, though his gut twisted painfully. "Yeah," he muttered, "we better." A big question mark in personal relationships. As the investigation into Daniel Carter's death deepened, the focus began to shift from the physical evidence at the lake to the people who had surrounded Daniel in life, those who knew him best, or at least claimed they did. In a town like Evergreen Pines, relationships were as much a part of the fabric of life as the peeling white church on Main Street or the distant call of trains at midnight. Everyone was connected in one way or another, but cracks in those connections were beginning to show. Sheriff Walt Henderson had always believed in the strength of personal bonds. Evergreen Pines thrived on a reputation for closeness, but he also knew that closeness could breed resentment, envy, and even quiet hatred over time. It wasn't unheard of for small-town relationships to hide deeper emotions that didn't bubble to the surface until pressure was applied. And now, that pressure had broken the town wide open. "We need to dig into Daniel's personal life," Walt muttered to his team on a crisp autumn morning, the early sunlight casting long shadows across the station's floorboards. His chair creaked as he leaned back, eyes scanning the board cluttered with photos, notes, and scrawled arrows connecting names to events. Happy marriages don't always mean peaceful ones, and a man like Daniel, good as he wasn't perfect. Deputy Mike Henderson tilted his head, his pen tapping against his notepad. "You really think there was something going on between him and Mary?" "I don't know, Sheriff. They seemed like, picture perfect, you know?" "That's the thing about perfect pictures," Walt said, his tone heavy. "They're staged." Mary Carter had begun drawing quiet attention from the townsfolk. At first it was sympathy. Her pale face and hollowed eyes had been hard to miss during those early days of grief. But as more time passed, whispers began to replace pity. People started noticing the smallest details, the moments that seemed off. "She doesn't cry like she used to," Betty Jenkins whispered over a steaming plate of biscuits at Marge's diner. "Lost my John a few years ago. Couldn't keep it together for weeks. Mary just looks cold now, don't you think?" "Or guilty," Tom Foster chimed in, leaning closer to the table. By the time Walt questioned Mary again, the suspicion swirling around her had reached a quiet roar. Sitting at the same kitchen table she had occupied when he first questioned her the week before, Mary looked more fragile somehow, like a house of cards about to collapse, but her answers were no less defensive. "Sheriff," she said, her voice tight as she shifted in her chair, "I already told you, Danny didn't have enemies. Nobody wanted to hurt him." "Nobody besides you?" Walt asked it softly, almost gently, but it hit like a hammer. Mary's eyes widened, her lips parting in shock. "How can you even suggest that?" she hissed, her voice breaking. "He was my husband. My husband. I loved Daniel. Ask anyone." "I know it's hard to hear," Walt replied, his thick hands folded on the table in front of him. "But sometimes love isn't the only thing in a house, Mary, and when it's not, secrets have a way of festering." Her response was immediate and pointed. "You're looking in the wrong places. Daniel hated conflict. Me? I fought for this marriage. If we had problems, and I'm not saying we did, they weren't bad enough to do this." And yet even as she spoke there was something Walter noticed, just a flicker, a shadow crossing her face when she finished the sentence. It was fleeting, but he marked it in his notebook as she stared away, avoiding his direct gaze. It wasn't long before conversations with the townsfolk brought forward a name no one had wanted to speak of directly: Jacob Sanders. Jacob was Daniel and Mary's neighbor. He had moved to Evergreen Pines just 5 years ago, but had quickly become a fixture in their quiet corner of town. Known for his strong build, charm, and easygoing friendliness, Jacob was the kind of man everyone liked, but underneath the surface, there were signs of something deeper, something dangerous. "Jacob was always around," said Sarah, the neighbor across the street, during a conversation at her tidy dining room table. "Not just stopping by to say hi or borrow a wrench, you know. It was little things, like how he'd mow the Carter's lawn without being asked, or how he'd hang around the fence line just waiting for Mary to come outside. It was weird. Weird how? Walt pressed, leaning forward. Sarah hesitated, glancing at her hands. Odd enough that I mentioned it to my husband. Jacob's been, well, cozy with Mary for a while. I wouldn't have thought much of it if it weren't for how Daniel sometimes looked at him. What do you mean? She bit her lip, clearly nervous to cross the invisible line of exposing something private. There'd be this tension. I saw it once during a barbecue we all had. Daniel was talking to Jacob, smiling, but his hands were clenched so tight I thought he'd pop his beer can. The investigation deepened after Sarah's comments. Walt's team confirmed bits and pieces of the story. Jacob could often be seen around the Carters' home. It was helpful, sure, but maybe too helpful. And then came the bombshell. Mike walked into the sheriff's office one evening, his face pale. "Sheriff," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "we got Jacob's phone records." Walt's brow furrowed. "And?" Well, it's not just calls. Texts, too. To Mary. Dozens of them. They go back years. And, Sheriff..." Mike hesitated, his hand tightening around the paper he was holding. "The last one's from the night before Daniel disappeared. Just one word." Walt narrowed his eyes. "What word?" Mike handed over the slip. Though smudged from handling, the message was clear. Sent at 11:03 p.m., it read, "Tomorrow." Walt didn't let himself exhale immediately. The edge of the paper crinkled between his fingers as he stared at the simple word that suddenly felt enormous. "Get me Jacob Sanders," he said, standing abruptly. "Now!" The unexpected suspect. The sheriff's car rumbled down the gravel road leading to Jacob Sanders' modest two-story home. Sitting on the outskirts of town, it had the kind of weathered charm you'd expect from a man who prided himself on hard work. Freshly chopped wood stacked neatly on the side, a well-tended garden out front. But to Walt Henderson it now felt more calculated than warm, especially considering the growing storm of suspicion surrounding the man who lived there. "Can't deny it, Walt," grumbled Deputy Mike Henderson, seated in the passenger seat, tapping his fingers anxiously on the dashboard. "It's starting to add up. The text to Mary, him hanging around the Carter's place, and now that last message, tomorrow." Walt didn't respond. He kept his eyes on the road, his jaw tight. Something about this case felt heavier than others he'd dealt with. Sure, Evergreen Pines had its share of family drama and disputes, but murder? It was almost unthinkable. Yet here he was, pulling into Jacob Sanders' gravel driveway to question a man whose name suddenly felt like a puzzle piece shoved into the wrong place. Jacob appeared on the porch before Walt had even stepped out of the car. Dressed in worn jeans and a flannel shirt, his hands were jammed into his pockets. His tall, broad frame was silhouetted against the peeling paint of his house, and his face held the easy smile of a man who wasn't easily rattled, or perhaps, Walt thought grimly, a man used to hiding something. "Sheriff," Jacob called out, his voice friendly yet measured. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Walt stepped out of the car, gravel crunching under his boots as he moved toward the porch. Behind him, Mike followed, his notebook already in hand. "Afternoon, Jacob," Walt said, tipping his hat ever so slightly. "Got a few questions for you. Mind if we talk inside?" Jacob nodded, though his smile faltered just enough for Walt to notice. "Sure thing, Sheriff. Come on in." Inside, Jacob's house was immaculate, almost unnervingly so. The hardwood floors gleamed, every surface dust-free, every piece of furniture meticulously arranged. It smelled faintly of coffee and sawdust, like the scent of someone who was always working on something. Walt couldn't help but wonder if keeping things spotless was Jacob's way of keeping control, or perhaps something else entirely. "Coffee?" Jacob offered, gesturing toward the kitchen, his tone polite but guarded. "No thanks," Walt replied, settling onto the couch. "This won't take too long if you're straight with us." Jacob eased into the armchair opposite the sheriff, leaning back with an air of calm that Walt couldn't decide was genuine or rehearsed. "You've probably heard we're investigating Daniel Carter's death," Walt began, leveling Jacob with a steady gaze. "Course," Jacob said, his expression serious. "Whole town's in shock over it. Danny was a good man. I can't imagine who'd want to hurt him." "That's what we're trying to figure out," Walt replied, his voice measured. "But your name's come up a couple of times during interviews. Wanted to follow up on that." Jacob's brows furrowed slightly, the first crack in his calm demeanor. "My name?" "People say you were close with the Carters," Walt continued, not breaking his gaze. "Spent a lot of time with them. Helping out around the house, things like that." Jacob nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did. Is that a crime now? Helping your neighbors?" "No, it's not," Walt admitted, leaning forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. but your visits seem to have been frequent. Some folks say a bit too frequent, especially when it came to Mary. At the mention of Mary, Jacob's jaw tightened. He kept his voice calm, but there was a faint edge to his tone. Is being neighborly something to be suspicious of now? Mary and Daniel were my friends. If Mary needed a hand around the house, I was happy to be there. Good friends were you? Walt pressed, his voice low but sharp. Jacob held Walt's gaze, his expression unreadable. Yeah, Sheriff. Good friends. You'd do the same, wouldn't you, if one of your neighbors needed help? Walt decided to let the silence do the work for a moment, watching Jacob carefully as the man shifted slightly in his seat. You close enough to text her? Deputy Mike interjected, finally breaking the quiet. Jacob's brow furrowed. What's that supposed to mean? We've seen your phone records, Mike added bluntly. Dozens of messages back and forth with Mary, a few late at night, and then that last one you sent, hours before Daniel disappeared. Tomorrow, care to explain that? To Walt's surprise, Jacob didn't stiffen or falter. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees now as he rubbed his face with his hands. When he looked back up, there was a flicker of irritation in his eyes, but no panic. I won't lie to you, Sheriff, Jacob said, his voice quieter now. Mary and I, we were close. Closer than maybe we should have been, but it wasn't like that. Then what was it like, Jacob? Walt challenged, his voice steady but pressing. Jacob exhaled sharply, his hands gripping the arms of the chair. She was unhappy, all right. She'd talk to me. Vent. About Daniel, about their marriage, about feeling stuck. I listened, that's all. And yeah, maybe I sent her too many texts, but that doesn't mean I had anything to do with what happened to Danny. What about the text you sent the night before he disappeared? Mike asked, his tone skeptical. That text, Jacob said, shaking his head, was about helping her fix something around the house. She said she'd left Daniel a message and asked if I could stop by to take a look at the fence in the backyard the next day. You expect us to believe that? Walt asked, his voice low, his eyes narrowing. It's the truth, Jacob shot back firmly, his voice growing sharper. You want to paint me as some kind of murderer because I helped a neighbor? Because I was a little too friendly? I didn't lay a finger on Danny. For a long moment, silence stretched between the three men. Walt could feel the weight of Jacob's defiance in the air, but there was something underneath it, something unspoken. We'll be confirming your alibi, Walt said finally, rising from the couch and adjusting his belt. He stepped closer, meeting Jacob's gaze. Don't leave town, Jacob. We're not done here. As Walt and Mike walked out to the car, the tension followed them like a shadow. Jacob lingered in the doorway, watching them leave, his expression unreadable. You think he's telling the truth? Mike asked as Walt started the engine. Walt didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed focused on the road ahead, his thoughts a swirling mess of half-formed theories and gut instincts. Truth or lies, he muttered finally. He knows more than he's letting on. As they drove back toward the station, a feeling of unease settled firmly over Sheriff Walt Henderson. Whether Jacob Sanders was guilty or not, one thing was certain. The peaceful surface of evergreen pines had been shattered, and the cracks were spreading faster than anyone could control. The secrets revealed. The days following Jacob Sanders' interrogation were filled with a thick, suffocating tension. Evergreen pines, usually a bubble of smiles and porch-front gossip, had become a boiling kettle of suspicion and guarded whispers. At Marge's diner, familiar faces grew more cautious, their conversations peppered with conspiracies wrapped in half-truths. The town had always relied on the idea that nothing truly bad could happen here. That illusion was now gone. Sheriff Walt Henderson spent those same days hunched over the evidence board at the station, his fingers tracing the lines connecting photos, witness statements, and timestamps, as if everything would suddenly click into place. But instead of clarity, the picture only seemed more fragmented. I don't like where this is going, muttered Deputy Mike Henderson, tossing a ball of crumpled paper toward the trash and missing. Where it's going, Walt replied, his voice coming out grim and clipped, is somewhere dark. We're digging, Mike, and the deeper we go, the uglier it gets. It was Jane Harper, sharp-eyed and always tenacious, who burst into Walt's office later that morning, clutching a folder filled with the latest results from the forensic lab. Her cheeks were flushed with adrenaline as she slapped the folder onto his cluttered desk. It's all connected, Mary, Jacob, and Daniel, Jane announced, leaning her hands on the desk. You ready for this, Walt? Walt raised an eyebrow before flipping open the folder. Go ahead, Jane, I can take it. Let's start with Mary Carter, Jane began, tapping the edge of her notebook. We've pieced together her texts and emails over the last year. Guess what? She wrote to her divorce lawyer 4 months ago. She didn't file yet, but she was getting advice on how to untangle assets. Walt exhaled sharply and leaned back in his chair, one hand absently gripping his coffee mug. So she wasn't the picture-perfect wife everyone thought she was. Not quite, Jane continued, flipping a page in her notebook. Seems like Mary wanted out, but there's a catch. Their joint assets, combined with insurance policies, were much bigger than anyone suspected. If Daniel died, Mary stood to inherit close to $700,000 between the house, his life insurance, and some old family investments. Walt frowned deeply, the weight of the revelation settling in his gut. And Jacob? Where does he fit into all this? Jane handed over another sheet of paper, phone records, text transcripts, and flagged locations. Jacob wasn't just flirting with Mary, Walt. They were having a full-blown affair for 2 years. They met up in hotels outside of town, spent hours texting behind Daniel's back. And the night before Daniel disappeared, Jacob pinged the same cell tower near the Carter house. Looks like he stopped by for an unannounced visit after dark. That bastard, Mike muttered under his breath, pacing by the window. That explains the text message, Walt said, piecing it together out loud. Tomorrow? They were planning something, but was it her idea or his? He leaned forward again, resting his arms on the desk. What else? There's more, isn't there? Jane nodded, her jaw tightening. There always is. She pulled out a grainy surveillance photo from a gas station on Route 12, taken around 9:45 p.m., just hours before Daniel was last seen. It showed Jacob filling up his truck. In the passenger seat, barely visible through the reflection on the glass, was Mary Carter. Walt let out a low whistle, the sort of sound someone makes when both impressed and horrified. That's it, he said gravely. They were together that night. The next step was confronting Mary Carter. Walt approached the Carter house later that afternoon, the autumn sun doing little to soften the chill in the air. Mary answered the door reluctantly, her face pale and drawn as if the energy had been drained from her entirely. She stepped aside wordlessly, letting Walt in, her hands fidgeting with the seam of her sweater. Mary, Walt began, his voice steady but firm as he sat across from her at the kitchen table. We need to go over a few things. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her knuckles whitening as she clasped her hands on the table. What things, Sheriff? We've got your texts, your emails to your lawyer, Jacob's phone records, and photographs putting you two together the night Daniel disappeared, Walt said, sliding the grainy surveillance photo across the table toward her. He watched her eyes flicker over it, her expression tight. It's all here, Mary. You've been lying to me. Mary's lips trembled as she glanced away, tears welling in her eyes but refusing to fall. I didn't want any of this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Didn't want what, Mary? Walt leaned forward slightly. To cheat on your husband, to plot something behind his back, or to get caught. Her head snapped up, her eyes flashing with anger and desperation. You don't understand, Sheriff. You don't know what it was like. Daniel, he wasn't the perfect man everyone thought. He could be cold, stubborn, controlling. Her voice cracked as she leaned back, running her hands through her hair. But did that justify what happened to him? Someone murdered him, Mary? Walt cut in, his voice rising slightly. Her trembling hands covered her face, her breath hitching in ragged sobs. Finally, she whispered through her fingers, It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Walt froze. The weight of her words hit like a hammer. What wasn't supposed to happen, Mary? She looked up at him, her face pale and streaked with tears. Jacob promised me it would be quick, clean, no mess, no evidence. He said we'd finally be free, but I didn't. She choked on her words, shaking her head violently. I didn't think he'd actually do it, not like that. Walt's stomach dropped as the confession spilled out. She continued rambling, her voice frantic, jumping between apologies and desperate attempts to justify her actions. You're telling me Jacob killed Daniel, Walt said slowly, keeping his voice steady even as his pulse quickened. Mary nodded weakly. He said it was the only way. He said Daniel would never let me go, never give me the divorce or the life we wanted. Walt straightened in his chair, his jaw tight as he gestured to Deputy Mike to step out and radio backup. His mind raced, knowing that this revelation was both a breakthrough and a burden, the kind of truth that shakes even the strongest small-town foundations. By nightfall, warrants had been issued and Jacob Sanders was in custody, but as Walt stared at the evidence board back at the station, Mary's broken confession replaying in his mind, he couldn't shake the feeling that the story still wasn't complete. The darkness of what had been revealed was only the beginning. The truth, as rotten and tangled as it seemed, had been buried too deep to surface without leaving scars. And Evergreen Pines would never look the same again. A perfectly malicious plan. Sheriff Walt Henderson didn't rest that night. The weight of Mary Carter's confession and Jacob Sanders' motive twisted in his mind like a dark, unrelenting storm. He sat in his office under the dim glow of a single desk lamp, piecing together everything they now knew about Daniel Carter's murder. But as more details emerged, Walt came to a grim realization. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime. This was planned. Carefully, methodically. The next morning Walt called a meeting in the cramped conference room at the station. Deputy Mike Henderson, Officer Jane Harper, and a few other key members of his team shuffled in, their faces marked with fatigue. Walt dropped a manila folder onto the table. "They thought they could get away with it," he said, his voice low but sharp. "They almost did too. Let's go through it step by step. I want every piece of this laid out, every ugly truth." The beginning of the plan. "We know Mary wanted out of her marriage," Jane started, flipping through her notes. "That's where it started. She was tired of Daniel. Their life together wasn't the picture-perfect romance everyone believed it was. From what she told us, Daniel was controlling, cold and dismissive. She felt trapped." Walt nodded. "And when she started spending more time around Jacob?" Jane pulled out a series of flagged phone records. "That's when things escalated. Jacob didn't just listen to her complaints, he encouraged her. He planted the idea that life with him would be better. They built this fantasy together, but there was one big problem." She paused, turning the page. "Daniel," Walt finished for her, his jaw tightening. "Daniel wasn't just an obstacle to their relationship, he was the key to it working. They couldn't have the money, the house, any of it, not together, if Daniel was still alive." Jacob becomes the architect. "Jacob was the one who came up with the plan," Mike added, his voice darker than usual. He slid a piece of paper across the table. Jacob's handwritten notes. Rough but telling. "He's smart, Walt, real smart. Started laying the groundwork months in advance." "How so?" Jane asked, leaning forward. "First thing he did was build trust," Mike explained. "Not just with Mary, that was easy, but with Daniel. Got himself invited over for barbecues, football games, even helped around the house. Made sure Daniel never saw him as a threat." "Classic form of manipulation," Jane muttered. "Keep your enemies close." "And all the while," Mike continued, "he's whispering in Mary's ear, telling her Daniel would never let her go, telling her a divorce would ruin her, that they'd lose everything to lawyers, and eventually—" He flipped to another page where Mary's frantic text to Jacob had been flagged. "Eventually he convinced her there was only one solution. Daniel had to die." The lure to the lake. Walt tapped a photo of the lake pinned to the evidence board. "We know how they got him there. A phone call, likely from Jacob. The message was straightforward. Jacob needed help late that night to fix a broken trailer axle near the lake." "Daniel was a helpful guy," Jane said quietly. "He wouldn't have thought twice about it." "Exactly," Walt agreed. "He left home around 9:30 p. Mem told Mary he wouldn't be long. She knew exactly where he was going, and so did Jacob. Jacob waited for him by the clearing where the truck tracks were found. From there—" Walt paused, exhaling slowly. The weight of what came next hung over the room. "The attack." "This is where it gets ugly," Mike said, breaking the silence. He pointed to the coroner's report. "Daniel pulls up, gets out of his truck. Before he knows what's happening, Jacob blindsides him. Heavy object to the back of the head. Probably that tire iron we found near the lake, though it's still being tested for prints. Daniel goes down hard." "And the wounds on his torso and arms?" Jane asked. Mike grimaced. "Struggle wounds. Daniel tried to fight him off even after that first blow. He wouldn't go down easy." "But Jacob was younger," Walt said grimly. "Stronger. He overpowered him, and when it was over he dragged Daniel to the water and pushed him in." "They thought the lake would take care of the evidence," Jane added. "The cold water, the currents, but the body wasn't far enough in. Jacob didn't finish the job cleanly, no matter how much he promised Mary he would." The perfect alibis. "What about Mary's role?" one of the officers asked. Walt's eyes narrowed. Mary's role was to look the part, cry, panic, pretend she didn't know where her husband had gone. From the moment Daniel walked out of the house, she played the grieving wife perfectly, and she had Jacob to back up her story. "She stayed home while Jacob was doing the dirty work?" Jane asked. "Exactly," Walt said, pointing to another flagged record. "She sent proof text to Jacob around 10 p.m., domestic normal text, the kind of thing a wife would send if her husband was still alive. These weren't conversations, they were rehearsed alibis. And Jacob," Mike shook his head, his tone thick with frustration. "Jacob was smart enough to be unremarkable. He drove straight home after dumping the body, cleaned up, and acted like he hadn't left his property all night. If we hadn't found that surveillance photo, he might have gotten away without a scratch. The motive solidified. At the heart of it, Walt said, rubbing the back of his neck, his voice heavy with disbelief. This wasn't just about love or some romantic obsession, this was about money. They convinced themselves they deserved a fresh start, together, rich and free of Daniel Carter. Greed, Jane said bitterly. It always comes down to greed. The insurance payout was the cherry on top, Walt added. They planned to lay low for a few months and then reconnect publicly after enough time had passed. New life, big dreams, together. But people like that, they don't lay low forever, Jane muttered, folding her arms. No, Walt agreed, his jaw tightening. People like that always slip up. As the room fell into silence, the weight of the plan, so meticulous, so heartless, settled over the group. These weren't crimes of passion. This was manipulation, greed and betrayal wrapped in a web of lies so tangled it had nearly worked. Looking up at the evidence board, Walt felt a familiar wave of anger and sadness rise in his chest. They thought it was perfect, he said quietly, but no one hides the truth forever. The light of justice. The courtroom felt smaller than it actually was, its air heavy with anticipation and hushed whispers. As the town of Evergreen Pines huddled inside to watch the trial unfold, the once strong illusion of community had fractured. Neighbors sat side by side, stealing uncertain glances at one another, as if unsure who they could trust. At the front of the room, Mary Carter sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the aisle, Jacob Sanders sat stone-faced, his jaw set, his broad shoulders stiff. For all their scheming together, it was clear that any alliance between them had long since crumbled. Sheriff Walt Henderson watched from the back of the room, his weathered hat in his lap. His job was technically done, but closure still felt distant. He wasn't the only one who felt that way. The town needed answers, real, honest ones, and today was the day they would get them. The prosecutor, Louise Grant, was not a showboater. She never raised her voice unnecessarily and never relied on theatrics. But her reputation in the region was one of complete precision. A former detective turned lawyer, Louise excelled at drawing out the truth and delivering it piece by piece like an artisan assembling a clock. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her tone measured but firm as she addressed the attentive panel. "This was not a crime of passion. This was not a sudden emotional act. This was a calculated, deliberate plan, a conspiracy rooted in greed, deception, and the cold-blooded betrayal of a man who deserved better than to die at the hands of his own wife and his so-called friend." Mary flinched at the word betrayal, though she quickly recovered, lowering her gaze to the table in front of her. Jacob didn't move. Louise turned toward the jury, walking slowly toward them, making sure she had their attention. "Throughout this trial, we've shown you overwhelming evidence of this conspiracy. Digital records, financial motives, physical evidence, witness testimony. Everything points to one clear truth. Mary Carter and Jacob Sanders planned the murder of Daniel Carter together, and they would have gotten away with it too, if it weren't for the cracks in their so-called perfect plan." As Louise's words resonated throughout the courtroom, she turned to her first piece of evidence, a copy of the forensic report submitted during the investigation. "Let's start with the crime scene," she said, holding the document up. The screen on the wall, lit up with a photograph of Daniel's abandoned truck by the lake, projecting the haunting image for the jury and the audience. "This truck," Louise continued, her voice controlled but forceful, "was meant to stage the scene as an accident. They wanted you to believe that Daniel left in his truck, walked into the lake, and somehow disappeared. But that story doesn't align with the evidence. Blood spatter inside the driver's seatbelt, muddy footprints leading away from the truck toward shallow water, and this tire iron." She motioned toward an evidence table, where the murder weapon was sealed in a plastic bag. "Jacob Sanders' fingerprints were on this tool, the same tool that matches the blunt trauma on the back of Daniel's skull." The jury stirred, some leaning back in their chairs as the weight of the revelations pressed down on them. Louise let the pause settle before she went on. Mary's last stand. Mary's defense attorney stood and awkwardly adjusted his tie, clearly rattled as he prepared to cross-examine one of the star witnesses, Sheriff Walt Henderson. "Sheriff Henderson," the defense attorney began, "you've been in law enforcement for over 20 years, correct?" "Yes, sir," Walt replied, his voice steady. "And in your professional opinion, is it possible that this entire tragedy could have been caused by an outside party? Someone unrelated to my client or Mr. Sanders?" Walt raised an eyebrow. "Unlikely," he said firmly. "Everything we found, every clue, every lead, kept circling back to Mary Carter and Jacob Sanders. Trust me, we followed all possible avenues. If there was some mystery third party, they left no trace, which doesn't happen in a case like this." The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff," he said, lowering his voice as if attempting to appear conspiratorial, "Mary Carter claims that she was manipulated by Jacob Sanders, that she was a victim in this situation, misled by a man who promised her protection and freedom. Wouldn't you say that's plausible?" Walt leaned toward the microphone at the witness stand, his voice calm but cutting. "I'd say Mary Carter knew exactly what she was doing every step of the way. Looking at the texts, emails, and financial documents, it's clear she wasn't just following along. She was an active participant. This wasn't manipulation. It was cooperation." Mary's shoulders sagged slightly, her face pale as Walt's testimony hung in the air. Jacob's undoing. When it was Jacob Sanders' turn to take the stand, the room grew even quieter. Jacob was a tall, imposing figure, and when he spoke, his voice carried a quiet confidence that might have been compelling under different circumstances. "Mr. Sanders," Louise began, moving to stand close enough to challenge him without intimidation. "You're an intelligent man, would you agree?" Jacob tilted his head slightly. "I'd like to think so." "Intelligent enough," Louise continued, "to use your charm to gain the trust of the Carter family. Intelligent enough to plan the murder of Daniel Carter and make it look like an accident." Jacob smirked faintly. "That's your interpretation, not mine." Louise's eyes narrowed as she held up a document. "These are your text messages to Mary Carter, the ones where you discuss your future together. Where you tell her that Daniel is the only obstacle in the way of the life you wanted. Would you call that charming, Mr. Sanders?" Jacob's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "And this," Louise continued, pointing to the surveillance photo of Jacob and Mary at the gas station, "is proof that you and Mary were together hours before Daniel disappeared. This wasn't coincidence, was it? It was part of the plan, a plan you masterminded." Jacob opened his mouth as if to argue, but instead he leaned back in the witness chair, his silence doing more damage to him than any words could. The verdict. It didn't take long for the jury to deliberate. By the time they returned, the tension in the courtroom was nearly suffocating. The foreman stood, his voice clear but solemn. "On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Jacob Sanders, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant, Mary Carter, guilty." A gasp rippled through the courtroom, but no one seemed surprised, not really. Mary let out a quiet sob as Jacob sat motionless, his jaw clenched and his eyes staring blankly ahead. Evergreen Pines moves on. Outside the courthouse, Sheriff Walt Henderson stood on the courthouse steps watching as the reporters packed up their cameras and the last few townsfolk wandered off into the midday sun, talking in hushed tones. "You okay, Sheriff?" Jane Harper asked, stepping up beside him. Walt took a slow breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Justice is messy, Jane," he said after a long pause. "You expect it to feel clean, like tying a bow on a package. But this—" he shook his head. "This was ugly. No winners here, just scars." Jane didn't reply, but her silence carried its own weight. Walt put his hat back on and straightened his shoulders. "But at least he got justice. That means something, doesn't it?" Jane nodded, her voice soft but resolute. "It does, Sheriff. It does." The pain and awakening. The trial may have ended, but the echoes of Daniel Carter's death lingered like a heavy fog over Evergreen Pines, refusing to lift. For weeks afterward, the quiet, tree-lined streets felt hollow, like the life had been sucked out of the town. Porch swings stayed empty, blinds were drawn a little more tightly, and neighbors who once shared holiday pies now exchanged guarded nods instead of warm greetings. Sheriff Walt Henderson, more tired than ever, found himself walking the lonely streets at dusk. No crime to solve now, no new threads to untangle. Yet his mind wouldn't stop replaying the events that had unfolded. He thought about Daniel's smile in the old photographs, the easy, dependable kindness the man was known for. He thought about Mary and Jacob, two people who had convinced themselves that love and greed could erase the lives they destroyed. Most of all, he thought about the cracks that had spread through the town, exposing weaknesses no one wanted to face. Evergreen Pines wasn't perfect, it never was. "You look like a man in need of a beer," Deputy Mike Henderson muttered one night, catching Walt as he stood silently in front of the old gazebo in the town center. Walt smirked faintly, not turning around. "Maybe, but a beer won't fix what's broken, Mike." "You talking about the Carters?" Mike asked, stepping up beside him. Walt let out a heavy sigh. "The Carters, Jacob, this town—" Hell, all of it. It's like pulling a thread. You unravel one thing and find 10 more knots. He shoved his hands deep in his coat pockets, tilting his head back toward the pale glow of the streetlights. Truth is, this place isn't the same anymore, he muttered. Mike frowned. You think folks will ever stop whispering, lay it to rest? They'll stop talking about it, Walt said, turning to his deputy, a hard edge to his voice. But they won't forget. People like Betty Jenkins will be telling their grandkids, I lived through the Carter case. It's woven into the fabric now. We'll move on, but it's always going to be there, this ugly scar across the town's history. A community in shambles. The Carter house sat empty now, its once bright windows dark and cold as if the very home were grieving. Even the modest flower garden Daniel had tended to faithfully every spring had withered, the soil brittle and bare. The realtor listed the property shortly after Mary's conviction, but no one in Evergreen Pines wanted to buy it, not because of the price, but because of the shadow it now carried. At Marge's Diner, the hub of town life, the conversations hadn't returned to normal either. Where once the locals chattered about barn repairs and pumpkin pie recipes, now they spoke in hushed tones about what could have been. You know, I still can't wrap my head around it, muttered Tom Foster, swirling his coffee idly. Danny deserved better. He'd have given his life for that woman, and she... His voice trailed off, his face wrinkling in disgust. They had money troubles after the farm investments, Betty Jenkins chimed in from the next booth over. At least that's what I heard, but still, she shook her head. It ain't enough to kill over. It's not just the money, Sarah Harper interjected quietly. Mary, she felt invisible. I think that's worse than being broke. Feeling like you don't exist to the one person who's supposed to notice you. Tom frowned, but didn't argue. Still doesn't excuse it, though. She could have left him, divorced him, whatever. They didn't have to. He stopped, swallowing hard, the thought too bitter to finish. Behind the counter, Marge wiped an already spotless mug with a towel, her gaze far away. At last, she sighed. People forget, she said softly, though there wasn't a trace of forgiveness in her tone. They forget how easy it is for things to rot from the inside. The Carters looked perfect on the outside, but you peel back the paint and... She tossed the towel over her shoulder. Well, you see what's left. That was the haunting truth about Evergreen Pines. For all its postcard charm, the white picket fences, the Sunday church bells, the lemonade stands, it held the same flaws and fractures as anywhere else. They'd simply been better at hiding them until now. The families left behind. For the Carter family, grief took many shapes. Daniel's sister, Ellen, came into town only once after the trial, long enough to collect what few heirlooms remained from the house. She didn't linger, barely saying a word to anyone. The emptiness in her eyes spoke volumes. At Daniel's gravesite up on Pine Hill, fresh flowers appeared like clockwork every Sunday. No one claimed responsibility, though Walt suspected it was likely Ellen, or perhaps a guilt-riddled neighbor who hadn't been able to face the weight of community inaction. People came to his barbecues, you know, Walt told Jane Harper the following week as they stood near the edge of Pine Hill Cemetery. They drank his lemonade and let him fix their tractors, but no one saw it coming, not even me. Jane crossed her arms against the autumn chill, her gaze fixed on the modest headstone in front of them. You don't think that's the saddest part of all, Sheriff? The fact that no one really knew him? Not Mary, not the town, maybe not even us. That's the problem with small towns, Walt muttered, adjusting his hat. People think they've got everyone figured out until they don't, and by the time they realize it, it's too damn late. The awakening. For all its wounds, Evergreen Pines did begin to heal, though it wasn't an easy road. The murder had stripped away the town's sense of safety, forcing everyone to question not just their neighbors but themselves. How had no one seen the growing cracks behind the Carter family's picket fence? How did everyone miss the tension between Mary and Jacob? Tension that now seemed so obvious in hindsight? Walt hoped the lesson would stick. He hoped it might remind people to look closer, to listen harder, to be more honest, not just with others, but with themselves. Pain teaches us, he told the town council during a somber meeting a month later. It's a cruel teacher, but sometimes it's the one we need. If we want to make sure this never happens again, we can't just blame Mary or Jacob and wash our hands of it. We have to take a long look in the mirror, all of us. This town was built on trust, and somehow we forgot how fragile that is. What remains? The season slowly turned. Snow dusted the pine trees while children tiptoed cautiously where they once played freely. By spring, the town began hosting its usual events again, the farmer's market, the Easter egg hunt in the park, but a part of Evergreen Pines would always remain different. Walt saw it in the way people lingered longer at church, offering deeper prayers. He saw it in how neighbors stopped to say hello longer, truly listening instead of just nodding while passing by. And maybe that was the smallest blessing in the wake of Daniel Carter's tragedy, an awakening, painful and raw, but necessary. In the end, Evergreen Pines was still standing, but it had been forever changed. The town had been forced to confront the shadow side of its perfect picture and had come out the other side bruised, but a little wiser. That's the strange thing about pain, Walt murmured to himself one quiet evening sitting on his porch, sipping lukewarm coffee. You hate it, but sometimes it's the only thing that wakes you up. The final lesson. It didn't happen all at once. Lessons never do. In the quiet wake of the trial, Evergreen Pines found itself grieving not just for Daniel Carter, but for the trust, innocence, and shared history that had been shattered. The town's sense of identity, so carefully cultivated over decades, was now stained by betrayal, murder, and secrets that no one wanted to fully acknowledge. Sheriff Walt Henderson had carried the burden of the case long past the verdict. Even now, weeks after Jacob Sanders had been sentenced to life and Mary Carter began serving her time for conspiracy, Walt couldn't shake the sense that something vital had been lost. Evergreen Pines would move on, sure, but something about this case, this tragedy, felt different, more complicated. It was a sunny Thursday when Walt walked into Marge's diner, his boots scuffing the worn linoleum as the door's bell chime jingled above. The smell of coffee and freshly baked biscuits wrapped around him like an old blanket. The diner was quieter than it used to be, fewer locals stopping in for their usual orders. The usual chatter had been replaced by hesitant conversations, punctuated by awkward silences. Marge herself stood behind the counter, wiping a spotless coffee mug with her favorite towel, a routine she'd seemingly adopted as stress relief. When she spotted Walt, she gave him a nod and motioned toward the counter. "You look tired, Sheriff," she said, her voice sharp but motherly. "You need something stronger than coffee?" Walt chuckled faintly and slid onto a stool. "I'll stick with regular coffee, thanks. Last thing I need is for the town to think I'm hitting the bottle in public." Marge poured the coffee, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Wouldn't be the strangest rumor floating around these days," she muttered, setting the cup in front of him. Walt wrapped his hands around the warm mug, staring down at the steaming liquid. For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet between them wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy, a weight borne from having been witnesses to the darkest chapter in the town's story. "They're still talking about it," Marge said finally, breaking the silence. "The Carters, Jacob. Every damn conversation turns into some version of, 'How could they?' Or, 'Did you hear about some new detail?'" She shook her head. "The way folks act, you'd think nothing good ever happened in this town. Like one story's enough to ruin it forever." Walt nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "That's the thing about stories like this. They stick. People don't want to talk about the good, not when the bad's so fresh. It's easier to focus on the tragedy." Marge leaned on the counter, crossing her arms. "But what about the lessons, Walt? A whole town like ours, we're small enough to learn something from this, aren't we? Or does this kind of thing just leave a stain?" Walt tilted his head, considering her words. "I don't think anything's ever just a stain, Marge. That kind of thinking," he shook his head, "it's too simple. What happened here, what Mary and Jacob did, that's a wake-up call if ever there was one. This town's got a chance to learn from it, to be better. It just takes time." "And what about you?" Marge asked, arching an eyebrow. "What do you think you learned from all this?" Walt sighed and leaned back, reaching up to adjust his hat. "That's the kind of question that keeps a man awake at night, Marge. To tell you the truth, what I learned scares the hell out of me." Marge raised an inquisitive eyebrow, her towel still slung over her shoulder. "Go on." Walt stared out the diner window, watching how the afternoon sunlight filtered through the pine trees outside. "I've been sheriff for over 20 years in this town. Thought I knew every soul here. You grow up seeing the same faces, waving at the same porches. But the truth is, you never really know what's happening in someone's house, behind their fences, behind closed doors. You see the smile they wear in public, but not the resentment. You hear their polite words, but miss the anger under the surface." He turned back to Marge, his voice quieter now. "I thought I knew Mary Carter. Daniel too. Hell, even Jacob. But I missed it. All of it. And that makes me wonder what else I've missed over the years." "Sheriff," Marge started, but Walt raised a hand. "I'm not looking for pity," he said, shaking his head. "This isn't about me failing. Not entirely. It's about how people live their lives in the shadows, even in a place like Evergreen Pines. Nobody saw what Mary was really feeling, how trapped she thought she was. Nobody saw how Jacob saw opportunity where he shouldn't have. And nobody asked Daniel. Walt's voice cracked slightly with emotion. Nobody asked him how he was holding up, or how he might have been blind to what was happening around him. Marge nodded slowly, her expression soft with understanding. This town likes to keep up appearances, Walt. Always has. But maybe those appearances need to change. Put the truth out there more. Stop pretending everything's fine when it's not. Maybe that's the lesson to learn. Before Walt could reply, Deputy Mike Henderson strolled into the diner, sliding into the stool beside him. "Sheriff, Marge, you two solving the world's problems in here?" he teased, grabbing the sugar packet dispenser and turning it absent-mindedly. "Something like that," Walt said, managing a faint smile. Mike shook his head and leaned forward. "You know, this whole case, it's not just about who did what, it's about why nobody noticed. Nobody asked the right questions. That bothers me more than anything else." "That's just it, Mike," Walt replied, his voice steady now. "Everyone in this town, including me, took each other for granted. Forgot that knowing someone's name and saying hello on Sunday doesn't mean you actually know them. This whole place has to wake up to the fact that real trust takes work. It's not automatic." For a moment, the three of them sat in silence, the weight of Walt's words settling over the conversation like a heavy quilt. Marge finally broke it with a determined nod. "Well, if the town needs to wake up, we better start with ourselves, right here, right now. Ask better questions. Pay attention. And for God's sake, Walt, stop carrying all that guilt like you're the only one responsible for this mess." Walt smirked faintly. "You always know how to knock some sense into me, don't you?" "Somebody's got to," Marge replied with a sly grin. "Now drink your coffee before it gets cold." The town hears the lesson. As the weeks turned into months, Walt noticed subtle changes around Evergreen Pines. Neighbors began lingering longer when they ran into each other at the grocery store. Parents leaned closer when their kids shared something at the dinner table. And Walt himself started walking new routes on his evening strolls, paying attention to corners of the town he'd long neglected. At the next town hall meeting, Walt addressed the crowd with a quiet authority that stilled the room. "Tragedies like this one, they don't define us. But what we do afterward, that does. Mary, Jacob, and Daniel, they were all part of this town's history, and we failed them in different ways. What happened wasn't just murder, it was a failure to understand one another, to listen. If we want to call ourselves a community, then we have to mean it." The room was silent, but many nodded. Some even looked teary-eyed. "Evergreen Pines isn't perfect," Walt continued, his voice softer now. "But it's home, and home means more than just pretty fences and polite smiles. Let's work on that truth together." What endures? As Walt left the meeting that night, he looked up at the stars peeking through the pine trees. Evergreen Pines might heal, he thought. It just needed time, and the will to learn.